First of all, thank you for the organizers of the Web Today. I'm really glad to be here with all of you. So quick words about me. My name is Nicolas GOUTAY. So as it was announced, I work at Theodo. We are a web development agency. I build mainly JavaScript and Python web applications. I've been using in production React and Redux for over 2.5 years, something like that. I'm really excited to be here with all of you, as I said earlier, and you can find me online with my Twitter or GitHub handle @fax. So to begin today, I'm going to present really quickly React and Redux with an analogy that I found works really well to actually explain the philosophy and the basics behind it. Just a quick show of hands, who here uses React or Redux in production or has used it in a website? Okay, so quite a lot of people, thank you. So we all love Legos, we all know how it works. So how would you usually build something out of a Lego box? You would have your messy Lego tray somewhere, that you try not to step on it. Then you have your instruction sheet. So in this case, we want to build a Formula One. And you follow the instruction sheet step by step. And at the end, we got our results, the race car. In this analogy, the React application code, the code you actually write to run your website, it would work pretty much like the Lego instruction sheet. The bricks, the Lego bricks would be substituted by the DOM nodes, so I don't know, lists or paragraphs, tables, etc. And then React would assemble those bricks following the instruction sheet that you wrote, your code, and you get your result. So React is really focused on how things will look for the end user for your website. So if we get back to our little schema, we would have the DOM nodes in our Lego tray, and then the application code that the browser will follow step by step. And then at the end, we get our race car or website or whatever. However, on modern websites, how things look are usually, and it's more and more common that it's a function of the user input. So the websites of today are highly interactive. You get lots of animations, forms, buttons, etc. And the user, the average user, expects the website to be snappy and responsive. You can click everywhere. You get instant feedback for your actions, etc. So threading on with my analogy, the user in my case, when I'm building the Legos, would be Elia, my 5-year-old niece. She told me that red was her favorite color, so she wants the car now to be red instead of blue. And this is where Redux would kick in. So Redux is really strong at handling user input and processing it and actually make the user interface respond to it. So what I'm going to do is simulate a quick dialogue between my niece and I. And my answer, I will actually translate them to what Redux is actually doing behind the scene. So Ilya tells me that she wants the car to be red. So as me, her uncle, I actually take note that she wants her car to be red. I acknowledge her inputs. And in Redux, what will happen is that we would have an action, which is a key concept in Redux, called change car color, that will carry the information of the new color that we want the car to be. So in that case, it's red. And that action would be dispatched to, we will see a little bit later. So back to me, I'll search through my Lego tray and find all the red bricks that I need to actually build the race car in red this time. Going back to Redux, how would this work? We would have a special function called a reducer that will process the action, so it will take the action as input. And the information contained inside this action, so the fact that the color should now be red, will be added to what we call a store. A store is basically the place where we store all the information, all the data for our application. And then what I'm doing, now that I have all my red bricks, I just follow the instruction sheet back again with all the red bricks, and I get the red space, the red race car. Sorry. And for Redux, we would have the store passing the property color red, so what was inputted by the user, back to our React components. And so if we look back at our diagram, we would have the Lego tray would be replaced by the Redux store, so containing all the data that we need. Then we have the React application code, and if we follow back at it again with the right bricks, the right properties, then we get a red race car. So how does it look like with actual code? So if we saw three concepts, the actions, the reducer, and the store that passes the properties at React components. So if we start with the actions are really basically really simple JavaScript objects containing two main properties. The first one is the type of the actions. So what is the action actually doing? What is the intent of our user? So in that case, it would be change car color. So we have the type change car color in our action. And then we get the other key is the payload. What information do I need to actually act on the action? So if I want to change the color, the information I need is the new color I want to change the car to. So this action, when it is dispatched, it goes, as we saw, through a reducer. A reducer is a JavaScript function that will take all the actions as inputs and actually switch with a switch statement through one by one until it gets to the right case. So in our case here, the case change car color. And when we reach that statement, what the reducer is going to be doing is processing the new payload and the new action and storing it inside the Redux store. And the Redux store is basically a JavaScript plain object. So what we're doing here, it's a little bit fancy because we want immutability, but it's not really important. What we're actually doing here is set the color property to what we received as an input. And then when we have that information stored somewhere in our Lego tray of Redux, we want to pass it down to our React components so that we can rebuild the application, redraw it with the new data that our user inputted. So this is React code, really simplified for this example, but what we see is that we can pass down new properties, so the car color, or if we want the car number of the sticker, and then we can pass it down individual components, and when they will be redrawn, they have access to this information and they can act accordingly. So you can modify your CSS or the actual text or numbers that you display to the user. So, sorry, if we take a step back, we have, we don't see everything. We have what we call the Redux Loop. So it starts with the state. The state is all the data that our application needs. So in our case, the color or the sticker number. This state defines the UI. So what is shown to the user is a function of what is in the state. When the user clicks or interacts with our application in some way, the UI dispatches new actions, so change car color or change car number or something like that. The actions are then processed by a reducer. The reducer will update the Redux store. So the Redux store is the place where we store everything. And then the Redux store will update the application state, which will update the UI, and then we can interact with the app some more, and then we just loop all the time with React and Redux. So with this quick introduction, now I want to give you some feedback that I have about using React and Redux for some years now. And the first one I think is, in my opinion, is the most important, is the developer experience that using React and Redux actually brings to your teams. So the key point, what actually was a selling point for me learning React and Redux and then applying it on my projects, was that it really, really facilitates debugging. So debugging is not sexy, but we, as developers, we have to debug a lot of time. It can be bugs in production that have to be sorted out, or actually while developing a feature, but in the process of developing, it's quite rare that it works the first time, so we have to actually debug our way through the actual feature that we want to be debugging. And so Redux and React really facilitate debugging. And what I'm going to show you now is a really handy tool called Redux Dev Tools, and how it helps developers find bugs more quickly and solve them more quickly. So this will be a quick video. On the left-hand side of the screen, we have the classic to-do MVC app. So it's basically a to-do app where we can add to-dos and complete them and clear them, etc. And on the right-hand panel, we have the Redux Dev Tools. And so we're going to do a quick rundown of the capabilities of the Redux Dev Tools. So, did it work? Yeah. Here, I'm adding a new item to my to-do list, Web Today 2K18. And what we can see on the right-hand side is that I can immediately see the difference between my old state and my new state. A new to-do was added. Then another extremely important view is this eagle-eye view of all the state of my application. I can see all and inspect all the variables that are that define my UI. So here, all the to-dos. It's updated in real time, so I can see all the properties of all the nodes, etc. Here, I just cleared an item, and we can see that it was reflected. And then the real kicker is that we can actually time travel with the Redux Dev Tools. So the slider on the bottom is actually the different steps my UI went through. And so I can go back and forth and back and forth. And while debugging, it's really helpful, because if you have a bug report that says, okay, the user completed the form and then clicked there and did something a little bit unusual, you can actually reproduce it and then just go back and forth, inspect all your variables, see the impacts of all the user's action in real time, and it makes for really, really efficient debugging. This is actually a real-life example of what the eagle-eye view of my Redux store looks like on my actual project. So it's a little bit messier than the really easy to-do app, but I still have the same capabilities. I can zoom and pan and do everything and inspect all my variables, and I can really say that it helps me solve bugs faster when I encounter them. Now for the user experience, what I really like about React, so maybe for those of you who don't know, React has been developed by Facebook. Facebook is a pretty big website run by billions of people, so they have pretty picky performance standards and problems that they encounter. And so React was built with performance baked in the framework. And a little thing I wanted to show you as well is, maybe we won't see that much, but I used a Chrome DevTool tool to show you this video. It's called pane flashing, and what will happen when I launch the video is that you will see little green squares happening on the screen, and the green squares are drawn by Chrome on the area which are redrawn every time I do an action. So if I launch the video, so here we can see that when I click, no, the green doesn't show up. When I click on the Web Today or the Redux item, only this item is redrawn. If I try to filter between active and all to-do items, since all of them are active, none of the items are redrawn. So React really focuses on delivering performance, and to do that, it tries to minimize the number of browser repainting that it triggers. So this is really interesting. And if the defaults that React provides aren't enough for your special use case. You have access to really helpful API methods like should component update, which let you actually tell React and the browser when they should repaint some part of the components or the website. So if you have a pretty extensive, I don't know, dashboard with lots of data coming in and out, you can actually say, okay, when this little piece of data is updated, don't update the dashboards because it's actually not shown on the screen. And so you have really a fine-grained control about how the render is done by React. So this is really cool as well. And back to the developer experience now. Reason-aboutability. So this isn't actually a real word. It was coined by a JavaScript developer in London called Yanni Evacalio. And by reason-aboutability, he meant the easiness to reason about something, to wrap your mind about a certain system or framework or etc. I really love it, and I really think it applies to React and Redux. And why? Because the core philosophy of Redux is based around 3 pillars, 3 principles that I'm going to show you. But all of them at the core, at the philosophy, really makes the application flow and the development flow really easy to reason about. So the first principle of Redux is the single source of truth. As we saw earlier with the Formula 1 and Lego analogy, we have a single place called the Redux store where all the data about our application is stored and handled. And actually this place is a single JavaScript object, which means it's really easy to inspect, to navigate around, to update, etc. And so this single source of truth is part of what makes debugging really easy, since, as we saw, you can inspect all the variables, all the little nodes and trees, etc. of your UI data. The second principle of Redux is that the state is read-only. So I'm before building applications with React and Redux, I actually used AngularJS, so the old Angular 1.x framework, where a lot of things could seem like magic because you had all these back and forth updates happening, and you didn't really know what was really happening under the hood. Redux developer Dan Abramov really thought this through and said, okay, the state has to be an immutable object. You cannot update it as you wish all over your application, etc. In order to actually update the state, you have to go through the whole Redux flow, so dispatch an action that goes through a reducer, etc. And then you get from a previous state to a next state. Maybe some of you are familiar with state machines. It's basically the same principle. And the fact that the state is read-only and that we go only from step 1 to step 2 to step 3 with our states actually enables the debugging, the time-traveling debugging, etc. And it also provides a development flow that is the same throughout your application. So every developer on your team, when he or she wants to build a new feature, will actually have to go through the create an action, a reducer, etc., which makes it really easier to reason about your app, since everything is actually built the same way. And the third one, the third pillar, is that the changes are made with pure functions. So I won't get too much into functional programming for this talk, but basically a pure function is a function that takes something as an input, returns something, but have no other effects inside the app. It doesn't change variables outside of its scope. And impure functions are generally associated with nasty bugs because you have a variable that changes somewhere in your app and you don't know what caused it. And so the fact that Redux is really focused on pure function avoids nasty bugs and I believe enforces good practices of programming. So I covered some of the key benefits of Redux, but there are more, and there are also trade-offs. So for the benefits first, the ecosystem around React and Redux is really rich. So everything is on GitHub now. You have Redux has an API to allow developers to create and plug in middlewares. So if some of you are familiar with Node and the framework Express, the web server framework, it's basically the same principle. So you can code little middlewares that plug into the Redux flow and can extend its capabilities outside of what's possible with vanilla Redux. So you have tons and tons of middlewares. You can have middlewares for logging, to add offline capabilities with dealing with the local storage, etc. You can do asynchronous fetching of data. If you have to call an API to get, I don't know, your to-do list or something, asynchronous is handled with some middlewares by Redux. You can have libraries for easily building and maintaining forms, UI validation, UI feedback on forms, etc. Also optimistic UIs, which I think it's a really good trend in web development today. So optimistic UI, you may have seen it if you use Twitter, or I think Facebook does it as well, is that even when you use the Twitter app, the Twitter website, even if you're in poor network conditions, say in the subway or out in a country, I don't know, and if you click like or retweet on a tweet, then you will have instant feedback saying that it worked. It looks like it worked, but actually behind the scene, the actual event that will go through the API is put in some intermediary state and will be retried once you have a better network. So optimistic UIs is basically saying everything will go fine. We can tell the user that everything will go fine, and exceptions are basically exceptions. So you postulate that you are in the nominal path. When I like my tweet, even if I don't have network, I have the instant feedback that it worked. I try to defer the actual call or to retry it if it failed the first time. And then if at the end I get an error, then I can push the feedback on the user. And it really makes for snappy interactions, and it's, I think it makes for a better user experience. If you want to dive into the ecosystem, this GitHub repository by Mark Erickson is a really great place to start. It has lots of tutorials, libraries, middlewares, tips and tricks, etc. And Mark Erickson is actually the new maintainer of the Redux library, since the original creator, Dan Abramov, moved on to Facebook to work on the new features of React. So we saw that every piece of data that we want to have to actually draw our UI is contained in a single JavaScript object, which means that pretty much likely to database schema, you have to really think your store structure through and have to maintain it and make it evolve throughout the development of your app. So since this is a key point of Redux to have a properly structured Redux store, what I found really cool is that you can see what the best at their fields are doing. So you can think of Facebook, Twitter, or Pinterest, I think. And if you actually open the Google Developer Tools, you can completely inspect how they structure their, yeah, we can't see anything here, but we can see how they did structure the Redux store, what variables names did they use, how they managed to get updates, concurrent updates working, etc. So it's this transparency really helps becoming better at React and Redux, since you can absolutely inspect what the best in their fields are doing. What some people consider as a major drawback to Redux is its verbosity. So we saw earlier that in order to do any action, any UI response to an input, etc., you would have to write an action, then write the reducer that goes along with it, and then update your store and pass to React components, etc. And so this loop can feel quite cumbersome, and it makes you actually write quite a lot of code. And so, yeah, and if you build more complex applications with asynchronous HTTP calls, you would throw in other concepts like selectors and sagas, etc., that I won't dive into here. And so compared to the magic and the instant gratification of working with AngularJS, at the beginning it felt a little bit cumbersome and quite long. But after some time, so this is my personal opinion, I got used to it first, and I actually think it makes for better and more maintainable code, since everybody in your team has to build features the same way. You actually, when you dive into a new React and Redux code base, you're instantly at home. You can watch the reducer to see what kind of actions can be dispatched. Every action, if it's named properly, is really communicates what the intent behind it is. And if you throw that in with the Redux developer tools, you can easily see what parts of the UI are updated by what actions, etc., etc. So I wouldn't say well, this is my personal opinion. I'd say I became more productive with Redux, even though I write more code for the same feature, because I know exactly what to do, and the rest of the team knows exactly what to do, and so code reviews are better. We can focus on what really matters, like naming and refactoring, etc. And so building React and Redux applications for 2 years with several teams, I can say that I feel more confident in the code base than I did before with Angular or whatever other framework. So something that you may ask yourself now is, should I use Redux on my application? And actually this is a good question, because as we just saw, Redux means that you have to learn a whole new way of architecturing your app with the actions and reducers and the sagas, etc. So whole new concepts. Plus you have to write more code for the same features. So basically there's a trade-off here that I want to talk a little bit about. So Dan Abramov was the original creator of Redux, and he released, it was a few years ago, a Medium article which is really short, entitled "You Might Not Need Redux." I think it is a reminder of another article that was named "You Might Not Need jQuery" or something like that. But in this article, he really makes the point that Redux has its drawbacks and advantages, and that if you want to learn the ecosystem in React, etc., you might not need to start with Redux in the first place. So the key points, so this is a mix of what Dan Abramov said in its article and what I think and I found with my experience. So if you want to learn React, build your first React application, see what all the fuss is about, just learn React. Don't throw in Redux into the mix just yet. You build your React application. If it becomes maybe big enough, you will start to have small problems architecturing or updating your UI, etc. And then at that point, you will understand the benefits of Redux, and you might start to learn about it and implement it in your app. But don't go full React and Redux in the first place if you're reading React. Also, for small personal side projects or really small team, if you're alone on your team, or 2 people. Redux maybe, the cost of the Redux overhead may be too big. So you can just drop Redux and go React. And if at the end your startup MVP is getting successful or the team is getting larger, etc., you can throw in Redux in the mix afterwards. But if you know you're going into a long-running project or with larger teams, I'd say more than 2 people, I would consider using Redux immediately at the start of the project. If you know that you're going to need it afterwards, you can start going at it, learning it, etc., see how it is at the very beginning. So, as a quick conclusion to my talk, React with Redux is, first of all, a really mature framework and ecosystem. Actually, 2 weeks ago, React, the first commit on React, celebrated its 5th anniversary. The Facebook team building React has some amazing features in the way to make for even snappier UIs, more maintainable code, etc. So they're really doing a great job. It helped me, and I think a lot of other developers, to produce performant web apps. It facilitates debugging, and if you're working with a team, it provides a standard way of doing things that makes sense, actually, that teaches you about functional programming, and since everybody's following the same flow, it really helps enhancing the communication with your team, the code reviews, etc., etc. And as another throw in the mix, if you have heard of React Native, so React Native is pretty much React, but instead of doing web applications, you do cross-platform mobile applications. And React Native works really well with Redux. It's basically the same thing. I could have done the talk with React Native and Redux. So if you learn React and Redux, as a bonus, you get to know how to build mobile applications with snappy UIs and happy developers. And if you want to dive into this ecosystem, these amazing frameworks and libraries, I wrote a full-featured test-driven development tutorial on how to build a to-do MVC app that we saw earlier. So it's using React and Redux and a few other libraries I won't bother you about now. So it's available on my GitHub account. And if you want to have a look, I hope it will help you actually learn the ecosystem. I really designed it to be really approachable. So even if you are not familiar with other JavaScript frameworks and libraries, I think you can start with that. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. And I hope you learned something. And if you have a few questions, I think we may have the time.